Close your eyes for a moment and picture it. The rolling sea beneath a creaking wooden ship, the salty wind stinging your face, and the endless horizon stretching beyond sight. It might sound adventurous, even romantic, but if you were a cabin boy in the age of pirates and tall ships, this dream quickly turned into a nightmare. For you would be the lowest of the low, a creature barely above cargo in the pecking order of the crew. The cabin boy was usually not a man at all, but a child, sometimes as young as 10 years old, rarely older than 15. Imagine being that age and finding yourself surrounded by rough sailors, hardened criminals, and desperate men who had lived lives of violence. You, a boy pulled from the streets, an orphan, or perhaps the unwanted child of a poor family. Some were even kidnapped or pressed into service against their will, finding themselves dragged onto a ship they had never wanted to board. On land, you might have been a beggar, a farmhand, or the child of a struggling household. At sea, you became the ship's drudge, a servant to every man above you. Your world was reduced to orders shouted at you in voices rough with rum and salt, and to tasks that piled up endlessly. And no matter how hard you worked, you were never thanked. Because the truth of your existence as a cabin boy was simple. You existed to serve and to suffer. Life on board a ship was already cruel. Food was scarce, water foul, tempers short, and the ocean unforgiving. But for the cabin boy, it was doubly harsh. He had no authority, no allies, and no place to hide. Even among sailors who lived hard, violent lives, he was at the very bottom of the ladder. If a captain represented order and the mate's authority, the ordinary seaman at least had camaraderie. The cabin boy had nothing but duty. Historical records paint a bleak picture. On naval vessels, cabin boys were sometimes treated as apprentices, though the reality was still punishing. On pirate ships, things were no better. Pirates, despite their reputation for equality among crew when it came to spoils, had little patience for weakness. A boy on their ship was fair game for mockery, bullying, and abuse. He was given the dirtiest tasks, ordered about by every hand, and often punished for mistakes that weren't his fault at all. Imagine being roused in the middle of the night, your hammock barely warm, only to be told to fetch water for a drunken sailor. Or being sent up the rigging in the howling wind, your small hands clinging desperately to wet ropes, while the men laughed at your fear. A single misstep, and you could fall to the deck or into the sea, gone in an instant. No one would risk their lives to save you. The very title, Cabin Boy, tells its own story. You were not part of the crew proper. You belonged to the cabin, the small, cramped quarters of the officers or the captain. It was your job to wait on them, to polish their boots, carry their meals, empty their chamber pots, and stand ready at all hours. In essence, you were both servant and slave, owned by the ship, and tolerated only so long as you were useful. There is a cruel irony here. Pirates were men who claimed to reject the hierarchies of land, who divided loot equally and elected their captains. Yet even in this strange democracy of the sea, there was always someone who had to be lower, someone to bear the brunt of scorn. That someone was the cabin boy. For some, it was a temporary role. A boy who survived long enough, and who managed to prove himself tough, might eventually rise to the rank of ordinary seaman. But many never lived long enough to reach that stage. Their small bodies could not endure the back-breaking labor, the hunger, the cold, or the disease. The mortality rate was staggering. Ships were already floating coffins for grown men. Imagine what they were for children. One chronicler of the 17th century described cabin boys as wretches of tender age, oft broken by labor before they be grown. Another noted that boys were beaten cruelly for the sport of sailors. Though exaggerated, these accounts remind us that the position was seen as miserable even in its own time. And then there was the fear. Every day, a cabin boy lived under the eyes of men far stronger and far more ruthless than himself. He never knew when the next order would come, or what punishment awaited if he failed. The sea was a place of superstition, where men believed in omens and curses, and boys were often blamed for bad luck. A storm, a lost game of dice, a spoiled meal, all might earn him a blow or worse. In the hierarchy of the ship, where every man's pride was balanced on violence and survival, the cabin boy could never win. If he fought back, he risked harsher punishment. If he obeyed, he was mocked as weak. He was trapped in a cruel cycle, and escape was nearly impossible. And so, the life of the cabin boy began with suffering, and ended, if he was fortunate, with experience. A few rare souls endured and grew into hardened sailors, but for most, the sea devoured them long before manhood. So when you hear the word cabin boy, do not think of a cheerful youth learning the ropes in the spirit of adventure. Think instead of a child caught in a storm of brutality, a lonely figure at the mercy of forces far beyond his control. For he was, truly, the lowest of the low. If life at sea was hard for a seasoned sailor, for the cabin boy, it was an endless chain of tasks that seemed designed to break both body and spirit. From the moment the sun rose above the horizon until long after it sank into the waves, he was kept in motion, fetching, scrubbing, carrying, running. And the cruelest truth of all, the harder he worked, the more work he was given. Cabin boys did not have assigned watches like ordinary sailors. Instead, they were always on call. At dawn, while other men stretched their sore muscles and gulped down what passed for breakfast, the cabin boy was already at work. He might be sent to fetch water from a cask, or to collect provisions from the hold. Perhaps he was ordered to polish the captain's boots, or to carry his coat and hat up to the deck. On some ships, he was expected to deliver food to every officer before he could eat a bite himself. And food was not the only thing he carried. The chamber pot of a captain or quartermaster was considered a cabin boy's responsibility. Imagine trudging through the pitching corridors of a ship with that sloshing burden, while grown men laughed and jeered at you. To spill it meant punishment. To complain was unthinkable. The boy was expected to endure it in silence, as he endured everything else. Above deck, the tasks were no kinder. The boy was sent to scrub the planks until his hands were raw. He fetched buckets of seawater, dumped them on the deck, then scoured every inch with brushes nearly as large as himself. If tar dripped from the ropes, if blood stained the wood after a fight, if vomit slicked the planks from a seasick sailor, the cabin boy was sent to clean it. He was the mop of the ship, wiping away everything no one else wanted to touch. When the sails needed adjusting, he was sometimes sent scurrying up the rigging, small and light enough to climb where heavier men could not. It was dangerous work, made more so because it was often done in bad weather. One slip, one missed knot, and he would fall to the deck below, or into the ocean, where no one would bother to rescue him. The sea claimed boys that way, silently and without ceremony. If these tasks sound miserable, they were made worse by the attitude of the crew. Older sailors saw the cabin boy as fair game for ridicule. They tripped him as he ran with buckets, dumped extra work on him, or ordered him to do things twice just to see him suffer. Some forced him to sing songs, dance clumsily, or perform humiliating tricks for their amusement. He could never refuse. To disobey meant a beating. And then there were the pranks. A boy might be told to fetch sky hooks or sail needles, imaginary tools invented to make him look foolish. He might be sent on endless errands for items that did not exist, mocked when he returned empty-handed. Sailors delighted in reminding him of his ignorance, laughing at his expense. Even when he performed his duties well, the cabin boy received no praise. If the deck gleamed after hours of scrubbing, no one congratulated him. If he fetched water swiftly, no one thanked him. His labor was invisible, expected, and endless. The only time he was noticed was when he failed. Then the laughter turned to anger, and the punishments began. Historical accounts confirm this cruelty. Writers of the period describe boys sent to run errands until their legs trembled, beaten when they slowed down, cursed at for mistakes that were not their own. They were shouted awake in the dead of night to fetch rum, to deliver messages, or to perform whatever errand a drunken sailor dreamed up. Sleep was a privilege, never a right. For the cabin boy, humiliation was constant. He ate last, if at all, and was often given scraps no one else wanted. His hammock was the least comfortable, hung in the worst place, where he would be jostled awake by footsteps or dripped on by leaking barrels. He was mocked for his youth, his weakness, his inexperience. If he cried, he was beaten. If he laughed, he was mocked. This endless cycle of work and shame stripped away any sense of childhood. A boy of 12 might already look twice his age, his eyes hollow, his body stooped from toil. Yet even then, the sailors around him reminded him daily that he was nothing in their eyes. And so, the cabin boy lived in a world of contradictions. He was too young to be trusted, yet given responsibilities far beyond his years. Too small to defend himself, yet expected to endure violence without complaint. Too inexperienced to be respected, yet blamed for every failure. This was his training ground, not a school of seamanship, but a crucible of humiliation. If he survived, he learned to keep his head down, his ears open, and his mouth shut. He learned to obey quickly, to move silently, to anticipate the whims of men stronger than himself. And perhaps in time, he learned the skills of a sailor. But first, he had to endure the endless chores and constant humiliation that defined his early life. For a cabin boy, every day was proof that the sea was not a place of freedom or adventure, but of servitude. He was the invisible gear that kept the machine of the ship turning, the boy whose suffering smoothed the lives of everyone else aboard. And the sea, vast and uncaring, offered no escape. Hunger was a constant companion of the cabin boy. He felt it gnawing at his belly in the morning. He carried it with him through the day's endless chores, and he often lay awake at night with nothing but hunger to cradle him to sleep. On a ship where every man fought for his share, the cabin boy was always at the end of the line. Meals on board were rarely feasts to begin with. Sailors lived on salted meat so tough it had to be soaked in water before it could be chewed. They ate ship's biscuit infested with weevils, drank brackish water that stank of rot, and when luck was kind, they had peas, beans, or rice. But for the cabin boy, even this poor fare was a privilege. He was often left with scraps, bits of fat cut away from meat, the heel of a biscuit no one else wanted, or the dregs from the bottom of a stew pot. If he was lucky, a sympathetic sailor might slip him an extra portion. If he wasn't, he might go hungry for days. And there was no complaining. If he dared to grumble, he was mocked for being weak or greedy. If he begged, he risked a blow. Hunger was simply part of his existence, gnawing away at his strength, even as the crew demanded endless labor from his young body. Water was no relief either. Ships carried barrels of fresh water, but they spoiled quickly. After weeks at sea, the water grew thick with slime and worms. Sailors sometimes flavored it with vinegar or rum to hide the taste. The cabin boy, however, was rarely given such comforts. He drank what was left, often from a cup passed around so many times it was grimy with filth. The taste was foul, but refusal meant thirst. And then there was sleep, or rather, the lack of it. Ordinary sailors at least had watches, a rhythm of labor and rest. The cabin boy had no such mercy. His hammock was not a place of peace, but a temporary corner where he might collapse, only to be shaken awake moments later. If the captain wanted something, the boy was fetched. If an officer needed his boots cleaned, the boy was roused. If drunken sailors wanted water, rum, or sport, the boy was dragged from his hammock and ordered to serve. He slept in scraps of time, stolen moments of rest in the shadows of the ship. His hammock was often strung in the least comfortable places, near the galley, where heat and smoke made the air suffocating, near the bilge, where the stench of waste and rot was overwhelming, or near the crew, where laughter and fighting echoed into the night. There was no silence, no safety, no escape. Exhaustion weighed on him constantly. His young body, still growing, was pushed beyond endurance. The endless scrubbing, fetching, climbing, and carrying sapped his strength, while hunger hollowed him out from the inside. He stumbled through tasks, eyes heavy, arms aching, yet the orders never ceased. And when he faltered, when fatigue overcame him and a task was dropped, he was beaten or mocked for his weakness. Historical records remind us of this cruel reality. One writer noted that cabin boys were often half dead with weariness, yet whipped for their slowness. Another described boys nodding in the rigging, their small hands near slipping, until a blow roused them. Sleep deprivation was as much a punishment as it was a condition of life. Even the sea itself denied him rest. Storms could rage for days, the ship tossing violently as waves crashed across the deck. In such times, every man was needed, and the cabin boy was no exception. He was sent running with buckets, ropes, or messages, his small body drenched and battered by rain and spray. Sleep became impossible, as every hammock swung wildly and water poured into the lower decks, and when sickness came, there was no reprieve. A fevered boy, coughing or weak, was still ordered to serve. His complaints were ignored, his suffering invisible. Only when he collapsed entirely might the surgeon, or more often a fellow sailor, take pity. But more often, the boy simply worked until he could not rise again. Imagine, then, what this life did to a child. Thin to begin with, he grew thinner still. His face hollowed, his ribs showing, his eyes sunken from lack of rest. He shivered in the cold, sweltered in the heat, and staggered under the weight of tasks meant for grown men. And still, no one pitied him. For on a ship, pity was weakness, and weakness was despised. The cruelest part was that he was invisible in his suffering. Hunger, exhaustion, and sleeplessness were his constant companions, but they earned him no sympathy. If he complained, he was silenced. If he cried, he was ridiculed. His suffering was a secret carried in his small frame, a misery that only he could feel. And yet, the boy endured. Somehow, through scraps of food, snatched moments of sleep, and sheer will, he carried on. For what choice did he have? The sea was endless, the ship his prison, and there was nowhere to run. So when you picture the life of a cabin boy, do not imagine him as cheerful, bounding about the deck, learning from kindly sailors. Picture instead a hollow-eyed child, clutching a stale biscuit as though it were treasure, nodding off into restless sleep only to be shaken awake moments later, stumbling through another day of toil. Hunger, sleep, and exhaustion. These were his true companions, and they followed him wherever the ship sailed. If the cabin boy's life was already filled with hunger and endless labor, it was made far worse by the role he played in the ship's cruel theater of punishment. He was not just the servant of every man aboard, he was also their scapegoat. When tempers boiled over, when mistakes were made, or when the captain needed an example, it was often the cabin boy who paid the price. In many ways, the cabin boy was the ship's whipping boy. His very youth made him vulnerable, his weakness marking him as an easy target. A grown sailor might fight back against unfair punishment, might argue, or even draw a knife in defiance. But a child could not. And so, time and again, the boy was made to suffer for things that were never his fault. If the captain's food was late, it was the cabin boy's back that felt the lash. If the decks were not scrubbed to a mate's satisfaction, It was the boy who was cuffed, kicked, or beaten. If a storm tore a sail, or rats spoiled the bread, or the cook spilled the stew, somehow it was the boy who bore the blame. In the brutal logic of shipboard life, someone had to suffer, and the weakest was always chosen. Punishment at sea was rarely gentle. The lash was the most common form, a rope or whip striking bare skin until it bled. Cabin boys, with their small bodies and tender flesh, suffered terribly under the whip. They were forced to stand at attention while their punishment was delivered, their cries drowned by the laughter or indifference of the crew. Sometimes the lash was administered publicly, not to correct the boy, but to amuse the sailors or to remind everyone of their place. And it was not always formal punishment. More often, it came in the form of quick, casual violence. An open-handed slap, a fist to the head, a kick to the ribs. A boy who hesitated, who dropped a bucket, who tripped in the rigging, might feel the sharp pain of a blow before he had time to apologize. There was no fairness, no appeal, no escape. Violence was as much a part of his daily life as hunger or exhaustion. Historical accounts describe sailors as rough men who often took out their frustrations on those weaker than themselves. And no one on board was weaker than the cabin boy. Some captains may have offered a degree of protection, but many looked the other way, seeing punishment as a way to harden the boy or keep order. A few even encouraged it, believing that fear was the best teacher. Imagine the fear this instilled in a child. Every sound of footsteps behind him could mean a cuff to the ear. Every mistake, no matter how small, could mean a lashing. He lived in a constant state of tension, never knowing when the next blow would fall. Even in his hammock, he could not fully relax, for he might be roused in the night to endure another round of abuse. This was not discipline in the modern sense. It was not about teaching lessons or correcting behavior. It was cruelty for its own sake, or cruelty as entertainment. Sailors, bored and restless on long voyages, found in the cabin boy a convenient outlet for their tempers and frustrations. He was both servant and victim, the unlucky figure who bore the weight of every man's anger. But beyond the physical pain, there was humiliation. To be punished publicly, mocked while he cried, stripped of dignity in front of the crew, this cut deeper than any lash. The boy was reminded daily that he was not their equal, not even close. He was an object, a tool to be used and discarded, a reminder of weakness in a world that valued only strength. Yet some boys endured. They learned to keep their heads down, to move quickly, to anticipate orders before they were spoken. They became invisible when tempers rose, silent shadows slipping away before anger could find them. In time, they grew harder, tougher, less easily broken. For some, this endurance was the only path to survival. But many did not endure. Some were broken by the constant beatings, their spirits crushed. Others died young, their bodies too fragile to withstand the lash and the fists. The sea claimed them not only through storms and hunger, but through the cruelty of the men they served. So when we think of the cabin boy, we must picture not only the child running errands or scrubbing the deck, but also the child with bruises on his arms, scars on his back, and fear in his eyes. The boy who flinched at every sudden movement, who braced himself for blows that came without warning. The boy who, in truth, was not only the servant of the crew, but also their whipping boy. And in this way, his life was more than miserable. It was a warning, a reminder to every sailor of what it meant to be powerless at sea. For the cabin boy bore the weight of punishment, not just for his own mistakes, but for everyone's. He was the living symbol of helplessness, the scapegoat of the ship, and he carried that burden until the sea or his shipmates destroyed him. If the cabin boy's life was already marked by hunger, exhaustion, and punishment, there was yet another shadow hanging over him, the simple fact that he was utterly at the mercy of the crew. Every man aboard outranked him. Every man had the power to command him, and every man could take out his frustrations on him. He had no rights, no protection, and no refuge. On land, a child might hope for family, for neighbors, even for the law to intervene. But at sea, there was nothing. A ship was a floating world with its own rules, its own hierarchy, its own justice, or lack of it. And in that world, the cabin boy stood at the very bottom, powerless against the whims of men who were often desperate, violent, and cruel. Sailors of the 17th and 18th centuries were not gentlemen. Many were former criminals, escaped debtors, or press-ganged drifters who had turned to the sea as a last resort. Others were pirates, fugitives from the law who had chosen a life of plunder and bloodshed. These were not men who valued innocence or kindness. They valued strength, and they despised weakness. And to them, a boy was the weakest creature of all. This meant that the cabin boy was vulnerable in ways too grim to fully recount. He was often subjected not just to beatings, but to every form of abuse the crew chose to inflict. Mockery was constant. They laughed at his mistakes, his fear, his inexperience. But the cruelty could go much further. Historical accounts hint darkly at the exploitation of boys aboard ships, a reality that is difficult to confront but impossible to deny. For a child surrounded by grown men, many of them violent and unchecked, the danger was constant. Even when he was not directly abused, the cabin boy lived with fear. He could never relax, never feel safe. Every look from a sailor might conceal malice. Every command might turn into humiliation. He learned quickly to read faces, to guess who was in a foul mood, to scurry out of sight when tempers flared. His survival depended not only on his obedience, but on his ability to anticipate danger before it struck. Some boys found protectors, an older sailor who took pity on them, or a captain who was unusually just. But such mercy was rare. More often the boy was tossed about between masters, each demanding his obedience. One moment he was polishing the captain's boots, the next he was fetching water for the cook. Then he was ordered to scrub the deck by a sailor who simply wanted to see him toil. He could not refuse anyone. Every man's word was law to him. And when disputes arose among the crew, the cabin boy often became the pawn. If sailors fought, the boy might be ordered to take sides, or worse, punished for failing to serve both. If something went missing, he was blamed. If food spoiled, he was accused of negligence. If the weather turned bad, he was sometimes cursed as unlucky. Sailors were a superstitious lot, and a boy was an easy scapegoat. Imagine the terror of living this way, day after day. To never know who might strike you, who might mock you, who might turn their anger upon you. To have no corner of the ship where you could feel safe. Even in sleep, you were not free. A drunken sailor might shake you awake, demanding rum or water. A prank might see your hammock cut loose so you crashed to the floor. You were not a person in their eyes. You were an object to be used at their whim. And yet, strangely, this constant peril was part of how boys became sailors. Those who survived learned to navigate not only the ropes and sails, but the tempers of men. They learned when to speak and when to be silent, when to obey and when to vanish into the shadows. Some even grew to earn the respect of their tormentors, hardened by suffering until they became as tough as the sea itself. But the cost was high. Childhood was stripped away, innocence shattered, and many never lived long enough to see manhood. The sea was merciless, but the men aboard could be crueler still. Disease, storms, and hunger were dangers faced by all. But for the cabin boy, the greatest danger was often the crew itself. They were his masters, his punishers, and too often, his tormentors. And so, to be a cabin boy was not merely to work endlessly or to suffer hunger and fatigue. It was to live in constant fear, to exist in a world where every man was stronger, every man had power over you, and mercy was a rare and fleeting gift. To be a cabin boy was to be at the mercy of the crew, and mercy was in short supply upon the sea. For all the suffering, humiliation, and fear, there was one bitter truth about life as a cabin boy. It was also the beginning of an education. But unlike a classroom with books and gentle teachers, the sea was a school of hardship, and the lessons were written in bruises, scars, and exhaustion. To survive, a cabin boy had to learn quickly, and he had to learn the hard way. From the moment he first set foot on deck, the ship itself became his teacher. Every rope, every sail, every creaking plank was part of a system he needed to understand. At first, his role was menial, scrubbing the deck, fetching water, cleaning boots. But as time wore on, he was drawn into the workings of the vessel. He carried messages to the helm, held ropes steady while sails were adjusted, and fetched powder for the gunners during drills or battles. Piece by piece, task by task, he absorbed the knowledge of the sea. Climbing the rigging was often one of the first skills he was forced to master. Though small and light, the boy was sent scurrying up the towering masts, his hands gripping rough ropes, his bare feet slipping on wet wood. There was no instruction, no gentle guidance. He learned through terror, each climb a gamble with death. The wind howled, the sails snapped, and the deck below seemed impossibly far away. One mistake could be his last. But over time, the boy grew surer, his hands calloused, his fear numbed. By sheer necessity, he became a sailor of the rigging. Knot work was another essential lesson. A ship was a forest of ropes, each with a purpose, and a boy had to know them all. At first, his fumbling fingers earned laughter and scorn. He tied clumsy knots that slipped or tangled, and the sailors mocked him mercilessly. But mistakes brought punishment, and punishment brought determination. Soon, his hands moved more swiftly, more surely. The difference between a proper knot and a careless one could mean the difference between a sail holding firm in a storm or tearing to shreds. A boy who failed too often might not survive, but one who learned could someday earn respect. The guns of a ship, too, became part of his education. Cabin boys were often sent as powder monkeys, racing back and forth between the magazine below deck and the gun crews above, carrying cartridges of gunpowder. It was one of the most dangerous jobs on the ship. A stumble, a spark, a dropped charge, and the boy could be blown apart. He learned to move quickly, carefully, and without hesitation, his small body darting through the smoke and chaos of battle. It was terrifying, but it was also training. In time, he grew accustomed to the roar of cannons, the screams of wounded men, the acrid stench of powder in the air. Navigation was beyond him at first, but even here he picked up fragments of knowledge. Running errands to the captain's cabin, he caught glimpses of charts, compasses, and logbooks. He overheard officers discussing the stars, the currents, the winds. Slowly, these mysteries seeped into his understanding. He might be ordered to hold a lantern while the captain read the heavens, or to copy a number into the log. These small tasks planted seeds of knowledge that could one day grow into skill. But make no mistake, this was not a kindly apprenticeship. The crew did not teach the boy out of generosity. They barked orders, mocked his failures, and punished him for mistakes. Every lesson was learned through fear, every skill through hardship. If he forgot, he was beaten. If he hesitated, he was cuffed. If he failed, he risked death. And yet, there was a strange kind of pride in survival. A boy who mastered the ropes, who ran powder without error, who could tie knots in the dark, began to earn grudging respect. He was still mocked, still ordered about, still beaten when tempers flared. But now and then, a sailor might nod at his quickness, or share a scrap of advice, or allow him a taste of rum after a long day. These were tiny victories, but to a cabin boy, they meant everything. For some, this harsh education opened a narrow path upward. A cabin boy who endured, who proved himself useful, might rise to the rank of ordinary seaman. From there, if luck held, he could climb further still. A few rare men who began as boys went on to become respected sailors, even officers or captains. But the cost was staggering, and most never lived to see that reward. It was, in the end, a cruel paradox. The same ship that starved him, beat him, and humiliated him also taught him the skills of survival. The same men who mocked and abused him were, unknowingly, his teachers. The sea itself, merciless and vast, carved a sailor out of the boy through hardship and pain. And so, learning for a cabin boy was not about books or lessons. It was about scraped hands and blistered feet, about fumbling knots in the dark until they came naturally, about climbing rigging with the wind tearing at your clothes, about running powder with your heart pounding as cannons thundered around you. It was, quite simply, learning the hard way. For centuries, stories have painted the sea as a place of adventure, freedom, and glory. Children on land heard tales of brave captains, daring pirates, and bold explorers who carved their names into history. And for some young boys, the role of cabin boy seemed like the first step on that glittering path. They imagined themselves learning the ropes, rising through the ranks, and one day standing tall as masters of the ocean. But the truth, as we have seen, was far darker. For every story of triumph, there were countless stories of misery, obscurity, and death. The cabin boy's life was not a romantic beginning, but a brutal test. A gauntlet designed to break most before they ever had a chance to rise. The myth of glory was not entirely false. History does record men who began as cabin boys and went on to greatness. The famous English admiral Sir Francis Drake was said to have begun his career in humble service, learning the sea as a boy before becoming one of the most feared commanders of his age. Some pirates, too, began their lives in the shadows of the ship, only to rise in rebellion and carve out names that echoed across oceans. But these men were rare, so rare that their names survive precisely because they were exceptions. For every Drake or daring pirate, there were thousands of nameless boys who never rose higher than the deck they scrubbed, who never lived long enough to prove themselves, who vanished into the sea or the graveyards of distant ports. The harsh reality was that most cabin boys did not rise in rank. They were too young, too fragile, too vulnerable to the dangers of sea life. Disease carried many off before they saw their 15th birthday. Accidents claimed others, falls from the rigging, slips on the wet deck, powder explosions in battle. Still more were broken by exhaustion, hunger, or abuse. The dream of glory withered long before it could take root. Even those who survived often found themselves trapped. Promotion was slow, and favoritism ruled. A boy might spend years as a servant, waiting for a chance to prove himself, only to be cast aside when another sailor's nephew or son was given the opportunity instead. The ocean did not reward merit as much as it rewarded luck. And then there were the pirates. The myth of the golden age of piracy tells us of ships where every man had a vote, where captains were elected, and where loot was shared equally. To a boy, such stories must have sounded like paradise compared to the tyranny of a navy vessel or merchant ship. But even among pirates, the reality was far less kind. A cabin boy was still the lowest rank, still the servant, still the one who fetched and carried, scrubbed and cleaned. His share of loot was the smallest, and his suffering was the greatest. If the boy dreamed of one day becoming a pirate captain, he dreamed a dream that almost never came true. Pirate captains were chosen for their cunning, their charisma, their ferocity in battle, not for their patience in enduring humiliation as a child. And while legends tell of boys rising to command, the truth is that most boys never rose at all. The dream of glory, then, was more illusion than promise. It was a story told to make the life of a cabin boy seem bearable, to give him hope when hope was scarce. Perhaps a kindly sailor would whisper it to him, or he would overhear tales in port. Work hard, endure, and one day you might be captain, they said. But for most, the sea had no such reward. What the boy actually learned was not how to command, but how to endure. He learned how to work through hunger, how to obey through exhaustion, how to suffer in silence. His glory was survival, his triumph a day without a beating, a meal that filled his belly, a night when he was allowed to sleep. And yet, even in this bleak reality, the dream persisted. Hope is a stubborn thing, especially in the young. A boy scrubbing the deck might still glance at the captain's coat and imagine himself wearing it one day. A boy running powder in battle might picture himself commanding the guns. A boy climbing the rigging might imagine steering the ship through storms. Dreams, even false ones, gave him the strength to endure one more day. But when we strip away the myth, what remains is stark. For most, the life of a cabin boy was not a step toward greatness, but a descent into suffering. The dream of glory was a candle flickering in the wind, snuffed out more often than not by hunger, violence, or the sea itself. So, when you hear tales of mighty captains and daring pirates who began as humble boys, remember this. Behind every legend were countless forgotten children. Children who dreamed the same dream, but never lived long enough to see it realized. Children whose names we will never know, who gave their youth to the sea and received nothing in return. For the cabin boy, the gulf between dream and reality was vast, and it was that gulf, more than anything, that made his life so unbearably hard. For most cabin boys, the sea was not a path to glory, but a sentence of suffering, and far too often, that sentence ended in an early grave. The ship was their home, their prison, and their tomb. And the cruel truth is that many never lived long enough to see manhood. Their lives, already fragile, were cut short by hunger, disease, accidents, and violence. Death was everywhere at sea. Sailors of all ranks faced it daily, but the cabin boy was more vulnerable than any of them. He was young, his body still growing, his strength not yet formed. The hardships that an adult sailor might just endure were often too much for a child. And so, again and again, boys wasted away under the strain, their lives extinguished before they had even begun. Disease was the most common killer. Ships were floating cages of filth. The cramped quarters, the stale air, the spoiled food, and the dirty water bred sickness with ease. Scurvy, caused by the lack of fresh fruit and vegetables, swelled gums until teeth fell out and left bodies weak and riddled with sores. Dysentery swept through ships, leaving boys dehydrated and too weak to stand. Fevers, infections, and poxes claimed countless more. With little medicine and less care for a lowly boy, illness was often a death sentence. Accidents claimed many others. A ship was a place of constant danger, slippery decks, ropes whipping in the wind, sails collapsing without warning, cannon fire shaking the timbers. Boys climbing the rigging could slip and fall, their small bodies broken on the deck below. Powder monkeys carrying cartridges during battle could be blown apart by a stray spark. Even simple tasks like fetching water or scrubbing the deck carried risks, for a misstep might send a child overboard into the merciless sea. And once a boy went overboard, there was little hope. Few sailors could swim, and fewer still would risk saving a child. Violence, too, claimed lives. Beatings that went too far, punishments that broke more than spirit, fights that turned deadly, these were all part of shipboard life. A cabin boy, already the favorite target of frustration, was often the one to suffer most. Some died beneath the lash. Others were simply beaten until their frail bodies gave out. Still others took their own lives, choosing the sea over further torment. And yet, their deaths were rarely mourned. On a ship, life was cheap, and the life of a cabin boy cheapest of all. A sailor lost was a comrade, a fighter, a skilled hand. A boy lost was easily replaced at the next port, plucked from an orphanage, a debtor's family, or the streets. His passing was noted in the log, perhaps, and then forgotten. His hammock and few possessions were divided, and his name was lost to the waves. What makes this so haunting is the sheer number of lives cut short. For every legendary captain who once served as a boy, there were countless nameless children who never reached adulthood. Their stories were never told, their voices never heard. They existed only for a brief span, serving in misery before the sea swallowed them whole. Imagine the sight. A small bundle, wrapped in canvas, weighted with stones. A brief prayer, a splash into the waves, and then silence. That was the burial of a cabin boy. No headstone, no legacy, no memory. Just the endless ocean, claiming yet another child. And yet, despite this, boys continued to go to sea. Some were forced, others desperate, and some even dreamed of adventure. But for most, the dream ended not in triumph, but in tragedy. The sea was a devourer of children, and its appetite was endless. There is a melancholy beauty in this, perhaps. The thought of so many young lives lost, their stories untold, their names forgotten, gives the sea its mystery, its sadness. Behind every legend of pirates and captains, behind every tale of daring voyages, lies a hidden graveyard of children. So when we say that it sucked to be a cabin boy, it is not exaggeration. It was hunger, exhaustion, humiliation, and fear. But it was also the ever-present shadow of death. To be a cabin boy was to live with the knowledge that tomorrow might never come, that your life might end in sickness, in accident, or in cruelty. To be a cabin boy was, all too often, to live a life cut short. And so we reach the end of our voyage, looking back on the life of the cabin boy. It is easy, when we imagine the age of sail or the golden age of piracy, to picture daring adventures, glittering treasures, and roaring battles upon the sea. But behind the myths and legends lay a reality that was far harsher, and no one felt that reality more keenly than the youngest and weakest aboard. The cabin boy was the lowest of the low, the servant of every man, the scapegoat for every mistake. He lived a life of endless chores, constant humiliation, and brutal punishment. He was hungry, exhausted, and afraid. He was mocked and beaten, at the mercy of a crew that saw him as little more than a tool. His body was fragile, his childhood stripped away, and far too often his life was cut short before it had truly begun. Yes, there were skills learned, the hard lessons of knotwork, rigging, and gunnery. Yes, a few rare boys rose from such beginnings to achieve rank, respect, even glory. But these were the exceptions. The rule was suffering. For every name we remember, there were thousands we do not. Boys whose hammocks were rolled, whose bodies were cast into the sea, whose lives left no mark but a faint entry in a ship's log. And so, when we speak of the romance of piracy or the nobility of life at sea, it is worth remembering the cabin boy. His story is not one of triumph, but of endurance, not one of glory, but of survival. He was the child who carried water until his hands bled, who ran powder through smoke and fire, who flinched at every shout and every sudden hand. He was the boy who dreamed of command, but awoke to the lash. The boy who dreamed of treasure, but tasted only scraps. The boy who dreamed of freedom, but lived in chains of duty and fear. To be a cabin boy was to live in a world where the sea was vast and merciless, and the men around you little kinder. It was to live with the knowledge that you were expendable, replaceable, forgotten. It was to walk a path where childhood ended before it began, and where every day was a battle not for glory, but for survival. And yet, perhaps that is why the story of the cabin boy lingers. because it is a reminder that even within the great legends of the sea, there were small, quiet lives, fragile, human lives, caught in the storm. The boy's story is not one of fame or fortune, but of resilience in the face of cruelty, of youth battered by hardship, of dreams swallowed by the waves. As you drift now towards sleep, perhaps you can hear the creak of the timbers, the snap of sails in the wind, the footsteps of men above, and the small, hurried tread of a boy below, carrying out orders in the dim lantern light. Picture him there, the forgotten figure at the heart of every ship, the child who bore the burdens of grown men, the boy who lived a life few would envy. And remember, if you ever think the sea was all adventure and freedom, that for the cabin boy, it was suffering, fear, and all too often, a life cut tragically short. And with that, dear listener, our tale comes to an end. Thank you for joining me on this voyage into the past. If you found this story stirring, if you want to hear more forgotten histories and tales of the sea, I invite you to stay with us. Subscribe to the channel for more sleepy pirate stories, leave a comment with your thoughts, and share this tale with others who might enjoy it. Your support keeps these forgotten voices alive. For now, let the waves carry you, the lanterns fade, and the sails whisper overhead. Close your eyes and rest. Good night, and may your dreams be calmer than the cabin boy's waking life.